Welcome to Loop TV. I'm your host, joined today by Loop's Doug Clinton. Our topic today is a megatrend topic. We don't do these very often, maybe once every decade or so. There are other trends that go every 25 years. This is a decade trend we're talking about today. It's related to identity and something that Doug has been working a lot on. If you pay close attention to my wardrobe today, you may notice suspenders. In fact, they're not suspenders, they are Carhartt overalls, which play into our conversation today. Welcome, Doug. And maybe let's kick us out and talk about the offline piece of identity. You bring up some different characteristics, but even before maybe the offline piece, just set the stage around identity more broadly in this concept of a decade megatrend.
Yeah, there's nothing I would say necessarily special about the decade timeline other than it's just, I think, a natural way for us to think about new things happening. And we've always kind of talked about how the decade of 2000 was sort of the decade of search in terms of the internet. The 2010s was really driven by social media, the emergence of Facebook and Twitter. And so now that we've kind of lived through this era where the internet it's pervasive, there's billions of people who use it. A lot of us live our lives on it for better or worse. I think we have this new trend coming in the 2020s, which is really around identity. And so to answer your question about identity and sort of how it worked maybe pre-internet, if we can even think back that far, identity, I
So this
think
would be the offline identity. Is that the
offline identity, right? When we see another person in public, a big part of seeing another person is sort of identifying characteristics about that person and quickly making, I think, a characterization of that person in your head. That's why people spend money on clothes. That's why people wear Carhartt overalls. That's why people drive the cars they do. There's all these things that we do in our normal offline life that help us convey the identity we're trying to present to the world. And so historically, I would say a lot of that effort is really tailored around luxury. And luxury is a very broad term. It doesn't just mean buying something expensive. I think it means using disposable income to say something about yourself to the world. That was traditional identity. And in this new world, as we think about 2020, and 2010 to me was the break, when we all moved to social media and our lives were no longer about just what we looked like offline. They really became about what we look like online. I think now this kind of future investment in our personas, it's now in digital instead of physical form. And I think that investment in identity will evolve very rapidly in the coming decade.
Makes a ton of sense. And you talk about in the recent piece that you wrote, there's some of the difference between social capital versus paid capital. You've orbited around the topic here, but can you set some definitions for us, some framework?
Yes, social capital is a term I stole, I think, from another person who's written about social media, Eugene Way. But the idea of social capital to me is it's just what you spend your time online sort of projecting, the things that you post on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram that you try to use, these posts to create your identity. That's social capital. Things that you're doing for free, but you're investing your time. And paid capital to me is where you're actually just spending money to identify yourself. So paid capital is really the primary mechanism if you think about kind of offline identity creation. When you buy the Gucci handbag, you're using paid capital to present to the world that you can afford an expensive handbag. And I think that the thing that's really interesting about the dynamics between paid capital and social capital is social capital doesn't really translate as easily offline. So if you go to like a protest or a rally or you support a certain political candidate, unless you're wearing a shirt from the protest or have some other identifier, most people will never know that you were there. But online, you can show your picture there, you can put it in your profile. You have all these ways to identify yourself with this social capital where you invest your time. Something I think that's really interesting is how this social capital element, which now is, I think, the primary factor of identity for most of us instead of physical capital, how the social capital emergence will sort of move into these paid channels. And so I think that can happen in two ways. One is with offline the sort of traditional paid capital, like your Carhartt overalls. I think companies that create tangible products may need to think about how they can integrate social capital into their brands and what they stand for. I think we've started to see this with companies moving into politics in the last year. And then on the other side, purely online, you have the combination of social capital, which is native really to these social networks, and digital goods. Things that are emerging like NFTs, I think are a huge piece of identity going forward. But those things kind of are natively online. They already have these pre-existing communities, and they're easy to demonstrate in an online fashion. You can make it your profile pic or whatever. And so I think that those two forms of combination of social capital and paid capital are big investment themes over the next decade.
Makes sense, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is unearth these transformative investment opportunities. And maybe we can talk a little bit about the why now. You could build an argument that was social started to gain traction in 2010, that kind of was a new form of self-expression online. And what is it? What's the piece now? You're talking about crypto, maybe the cyberpunk phenomenon starts to play into this, but why now?
I think it is a manifestation of sort of the evolution in the 2010 decade. So if you think about the beginning of the 2010s, social was just emerging. Twitter and Facebook were still growing sort of niche products in many ways. And we've now lived a decade where I think at the beginning of 2010, a lot of these social products, the purpose was really to kind of import your offline identity to online, right? A lot of it was bringing pictures on and status updates and things like that. And now that we've all been sort of living online for the last decade, and that's been our primary function instead of offline, I think now the digital domain is sort of native, right? And so because of that transition from a world where we were really using social media to just kind of bring in the physical world, to a world where the digital world is probably more important in many ways than the physical world, I think that's the why now. And it's not necessarily this sort of hard, tangible catalyst, but I think that shift has been made maybe in the last 2 or 3 years, and it's starting to present itself in real ways across politics, across how people spend money. You mentioned crypto and some of the trends there with NFTs. I think that is just the early manifestation of that.
What was there was some news recently from Sotheby's around some crypto assets or some cyber assets.
There was an auction today for a handful of NFTs, one of which was a CryptoPunk alien. And the CryptoPunk and alien is one of the rarest CryptoPunks. And for anyone who's not familiar, CryptoPunks they're essentially the original NFT. They were one of the first NFT projects that happened in 2017. And so they've become, I think, one of the representations of what NFTs can be. There's a really, really vocal and diverse community that's supporting this CryptoPunk movement. But anyway, one of them sold today for a $10 million bid. With all the fees totaled in, it was about an $11.5 million total transaction. And so, I mean,
is that an individual or an institutional buyer?
I think I saw it was an individual. It looked like someone who is involved with DraftKings.
Got it. And is the purpose that they do that? I mean, this is an extreme example. We're talking about $10 million plus, but the purpose of it is an investment to trade around it, to hold it for appreciation, or is there something around identity that plays into that?
People are doing all the above, and the guy who owned the CryptoPunk alien prior to the sale, he was interviewed in a piece I read, and he said that it was his identity. If you went online, his online profile pic was that particular CryptoPunk, and so that's really who he was. That's what represented him online for a very long time. And now, in the interview, he kind of said, "Well, I've traded from this punk to a new punk that he's using a different one, and so that's kind of his new identity, and he'll shape a new kind of aura around that new identity as he builds it." So I think people are using it for identity. They're using it to invest. I think when you have this kind of collision of things where you can make money and also use them as identity, it kind of creates this really potent brew where you have people who are speculating, you have people who are passionate collectors, and that sometimes can mean that prices can go out the window and rationality can go out the window.
Hmm. Yeah, there's more opportunity for irrational pricing when individuals come in versus maybe a more steady hand of a corporate buyer, but that is a massive opportunity. We're going to find ways at Loop to invest in this in the years to come, undoubtedly. And when you think about the trend from a consumer, there was like this very clear line 10 years ago when you stepped from an offline into an online social world. You built your presence around that. Do you think this identity megatrend is something that's going to be clear to people, that they are going to make a very like a very clear step towards this, or is it just going to be like an evolution where they see somebody doing something and they kind of slowly build their way there?
I think in some ways it'll be both. Just like if we rewound the clock to 2011, I think there were a small number of people who saw the future at that time and said, the world is moving from this, offline paradigm to an online paradigm. I need to figure out social and I need to figure out how to really live digital first, right? And people who figured that out early, I think, benefited from just compound benefit as the rest of the world sort of caught up. And I think we're going to see the same thing here. I think that there are a small number of people right now who are recognizing and embracing just the realities of identity in a digital first world, and they're starting to live it. And I think as this decade progresses, kind of to your point, I think the rest of the world and people who spend time online will be just sort of pulled into it naturally. They may not even realize that they're doing it, but they'll look up and say, last month I spent $100 on digital goods in this game I play, and I spent another $100 on Twitter to augment and manage my timeline and all these other pieces of identity that maybe they don't even think of it as identity. They think of it as these sort of utilities and these necessities and even
Hmm.
luxuries. But we'll find people spending a lot more money on that, even if they don't realize it.
You write that the ability to kind of manage your persona, your digital identity, is a luxury indeed. And is this ultimately something just for a small group of people, or do you think that the masses are going to want to embrace this?
I think it's a mass phenomena. My argument with the luxury statement is that yeah, I think what I said was basically expressing one's identity in an intentional way is always a luxury. It always has been, and I think it always will be. And I think about, an example, someone who maybe is lower income and they go to a NASCAR event and they spend the $35 on the t-shirt at that event. That's a luxury for them.
Hmm.
And it expresses part of who they are, who their identity is. And so to me, again, luxury is not about like the top end price of what it is that you're buying. It's really about the purpose of, the product. And often luxuries come with very high margins because luxuries are meant to be scarce. And so I think this is a phenomenon that touches everybody, no matter their income specter. We all want to project an identity to the world. We all want to be unique, and we all want to be part of a tribe. There's this weird tension
Hmm.
that means that we always have to be taking action and spending time and money to do that.
Amazing. You want to direct people to your blog?
You can find where I write at the Contrarian Mindset on Substack, contrarianmindset.substack.com.
For those of you who don't know, I have known Doug for over 15 years. He's the smartest guy that I know, and that comes with a high. There's been a lot of people before you, and you still hold that title, so I recommend reading your work. Thanks for joining us on behalf of Doug, myself, Gene, both of our identities in the digital world, and Loop TV. Bye for now.